It started as a normal day in a quiet town. The local high school's beloved coach, Mark Anderson, was seen working with students just like any other afternoon. But no one knew that everything was about to change. Just days later, Coach Anderson was accused of something no one in the community could have imagined being involved in the death of one of his own students. This wasn't just any crime. It was the kind that sends shockwaves through a town, leaving everyone stunned. The student at the center of this tragedy was 17-year-old Jake Matthews. He had been close to Coach Anderson, but what the town didn't know was that their relationship went far beyond the basketball court. What seemed like a regular connection between coach and student was hiding a secret one that would end in heartbreak and loss. Now, with a life lost and a community in disbelief, the truth behind this tragic story is about to unfold. Let's take a look at how something so normal could turn into something so terrible, changing the lives of everyone involved. Jake Matthews was an ordinary teenager living in a small town where everyone knew each other. He was quiet, kept to himself, and wasn't one to cause trouble. His focus was on school, and like many other kids his age, he loved sports, especially basketball. Jake had dreams of making the varsity team, and for that he needed extra practice. That's how he got close to Coach Mark Anderson. Coach Anderson was well-liked in the community. He had been coaching at the local high school for years, and his teams were always competitive. He was known to push his players hard, but he also took a personal interest in their success. To many, Coach Anderson was a mentor, someone who could guide young athletes not just on the court but in life. For Jake, this seemed like a good opportunity. At first, everything seemed fine. Coach Anderson saw potential in Jake and offered him extra practice sessions after school. They would work on drills, shooting, and conditioning. Over time, Jake began to trust Coach Anderson. He saw him as more than just a coach, he saw him as someone he could look up to. Coach Anderson offered advice on how to balance schoolwork with sports, how to stay focused, and how to deal with the pressures of being a teenager. But as the months went by, things between Jake and Coach Anderson began to change. What had started as harmless advice and extra training sessions started to feel different. Coach Anderson began texting Jake more often, at odd hours, asking him about his personal life. He started inviting Jake to hang out outside of practice, suggesting they grab dinner or go for a drive. It didn't seem like anything strange at first after all. Coaches often took an interest in their players' lives. But there was something about the way Coach Anderson behaved that made Jake feel uneasy. Jake's mother, Laura Matthews, noticed the change in her son. He seemed distracted, quieter than usual, and wasn't as eager to go to practice as he used to be. She asked him about it, but Jake shrugged it off, saying that practice was just getting more intense because he was trying to make the varsity team. Laura didn't push too hard. She trusted that Jake was just going through a phase, as teenagers often do. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Meanwhile, Coach Anderson's behavior became more controlling. He started asking Jake to keep their extra practices a secret, saying that the other players might get jealous. He told Jake that their bond was special, that Jake had a bright future ahead of him if he stayed focused. But it was clear that Coach Anderson was becoming more involved in Jake's life than any coach should be. As time went on, their relationship became even more complicated. Jake felt trapped. On the one hand, he wanted to make the team and impress his coach. On the other hand, he didn't feel comfortable with the way Coach Anderson treated him. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. The texts became more personal, more frequent. Coach Anderson would ask about Jake's relationships, about his family, and eventually he started hinting at things that made Jake feel even more uncomfortable. One evening, after a late practice, Coach Anderson asked Jake to stay behind. It was just the two of them in the gym, and the air was thick with tension. Coach Anderson told Jake that he was special, that he saw something in him that he hadn't seen in any other player. He said that their connection was important, that Jake could trust him with anything. And then, without warning, he crossed a line that Jake had never expected. Jake didn't know what to do. He was frozen, unsure of how to react. This was his coach, someone he had trusted, someone the entire town respected. But in that moment, everything changed. The relationship had turned from mentorship to something much darker. Jake felt ashamed, confused, and scared. He didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. He didn't know how to explain it or who would believe him if he tried. For the next few weeks, Jake avoided Coach Anderson as much as he could. He stopped going to practice, made excuses, and tried to act like nothing had happened. But Coach Anderson wasn't willing to let go that easily. He began calling Jake at home, texting him constantly, demanding to know why he was avoiding him. The pressure became too much for Jake to handle. The situation reached its breaking point one night when Coach Anderson showed up at Jake's house. unannounced. Laura Matthews answered the door, surprised to see the coach standing there, asking if Jake was home. She told him that Jake was out with friends, but the coach didn't seem satisfied. He insisted on waiting for Jake to return. Laura, growing uncomfortable, politely told the coach that it wasn't a good time and closed the door. Jake returned home later that night to find his mother visibly shaken. She told him what had happened, and the look on Jake's face told her everything she needed to know. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong for a while. But before Laura could ask Jake any more questions, he locked himself in his room, refusing to talk about it. From that point on, Jake became a shadow of his former self. His grades slipped, he stopped hanging out with his friends, and he spent most of his time in his room, withdrawn and distant. Laura tried to reach out to him, but Jake refused to open up. The only thing she knew for certain was that something had happened between her son and Coach Anderson, something that had changed Jake in a way she couldn't understand. The town of Brookfield had no idea what was brewing beneath the surface. To them, Coach Anderson was still the respected coach, and Jake was just another teenager trying to make it through high school. But the truth was about to come out, and when it did, it would shake the entire community to its core. The tension between Jake and Coach Anderson didn't go unnoticed for long. Rumors began to circulate among the students at school. Jake's sudden withdrawal from basketball and the changes in his behavior sparked questions. Some of the other players noticed that Coach Anderson wasn't acting like his usual self either. He seemed more agitated during practices, more focused on his phone than on the drills. And whenever Jake's name was brought up, Coach Anderson would quickly change the subject. Jake's close friend, Ben, was the first to confront him. He had known Jake for years and could tell something was wrong. But whenever Ben asked, Jake would dodge the question or brush it off, saying he was just stressed about school. The truth was too heavy for Jake to admit, even to his best friend. He didn't want to believe what had happened himself, and he certainly didn't want to talk about it. Meanwhile, Coach Anderson's behavior grew more erratic. He would send long, emotional messages to Jake late at night, apologizing one moment, then becoming angry the next. He would remind Jake of the special connection they had, pressuring him to keep their relationship secret. The more Jake tried to distance himself, the more Coach Anderson pushed back. It wasn't long before the whispers reached the ears of the school administration. Principal John Rogers, who had worked with Coach Anderson for years, began receiving anonymous complaints about the coach's behavior. At first, it was just small things, comments from students about how he seemed distracted or was spending too much time with certain players. But soon, the rumors took a darker turn. Some students claimed that Jake and Coach Anderson had been seen together outside of school, at odd hours, in places where a student and teacher shouldn't be. Principal Rogers couldn't ignore the growing concerns. He called Coach Anderson into his office for a private conversation, hoping to clear the air. Anderson brushed off the rumors, saying that he was just trying to help Jake through a tough time, that his extra attention was nothing more than a mentor's concern for a struggling student. Rogers, still wary, warned Anderson to be more careful about how he conducted himself, especially outside of school. But the principal had no idea how deep the situation really went. Things took a turn for the worse when Jake finally broke down and told his mother what had been happening. Laura Matthews had been growing more concerned with each passing day. She had noticed the messages on Jake's phone, the way he would panic whenever Coach Anderson's name came up, and the way he seemed to withdraw from everything he once cared about. Late one night, after weeks of avoiding the topic, Jake sat down with his mother and told her the truth. It all came pouring out in a flood of tears and confusion. Jake told her about the extra practices, the inappropriate messages, and the night that Coach Anderson had crossed a line. He told her about the pressure to keep everything a secret, about the fear and shame he had felt for months. Laura listened in shock, trying to process the reality of what her son had gone through. Her heart broke for him, but she also felt an overwhelming anger. How could someone she had trusted with her child do something like this? Laura wasted no time. The next morning, she marched into the school and demanded to speak with Principal Rogers. She laid out everything Jake had told her, not holding back a single detail. Rogers listened, his face growing pale as the gravity of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a rumor anymore, this was a serious accusation. The school was forced to take immediate action. Coach Anderson was placed on administrative leave while an investigation was launched. But even as the official investigation began, the damage to Jake and his family was already done. News spread quickly through the small town, and it didn't take long before everyone knew about the allegations. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge. Other students came forward with stories of how Coach Anderson had shown them unusual attention, though none had experienced anything as serious as Jake. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Anderson had been pushing boundaries for a while, but Jake had been the one to suffer the most. Despite the mounting evidence, Coach Anderson continued to deny everything. He claimed that Jake had misunderstood their relationship, that he had only ever tried to help him, and that the rumors were a result of jealous students and overprotective parents. But the evidence against him was hard to ignore. Phone records, text messages, and testimonies from other students painted a different picture, one of manipulation, control, and a relationship that had gone far beyond what was appropriate between a coach and a student. The town of Silverbrook was in shock. This was a place where people trusted their neighbors, where the high school was the center of community life. To learn that one of their most respected figures had been accused of such a crime was unthinkable. Parents began questioning the safety of their own children, wondering if they had missed any signs. Students who had once admired Coach Anderson now spoke about him in hushed tones, unsure of what to believe. Jake, meanwhile, was struggling to cope with the fallout. The attention was overwhelming. He had wanted to keep the whole thing a secret, to push it away and pretend it hadn't happened, but now his entire life had been turned upside down. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him in the hallways, could hear the whispers as he passed by. Some students supported him, but others were less kind, accusing him of making the whole thing up for attention. The investigation dragged on for weeks, and the pressure on Jake and his family only grew. Laura did her best to protect her son, but it was clear that Jake was suffering. The emotional toll of what had happened was too much for a 17-year-old to bear. He stopped going to school altogether, too afraid of facing his peers, too exhausted from reliving the events over and over again in his mind. As the investigation neared its conclusion, it became clear that something had to give. The evidence against Coach Anderson was piling up, but there were still those who supported him, who couldn't believe that the man they had trusted for so many years could be capable of such a thing. The tension in the town grew with each passing day, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. One evening, after weeks of silence, Jake received a message from Coach Anderson. It was short, cryptic, and filled with desperation. Anderson begged Jake to meet him one last time, saying that there were things that needed to be said, that they could clear the air if they just talked face to face. Jake, filled with fear and uncertainty, didn't know what to do. Against his better judgment, he agreed. That decision would lead to the most tragic moment of the entire ordeal. The night Jake agreed to meet Coach Anderson, everything felt different. He had spent weeks avoiding any contact with the coach, but something about that message made him feel like there was no turning back. He wasn't sure why he agreed to meet. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe fear, or maybe it was the hope that somehow this nightmare could be over. But deep down, Jake knew that meeting with Coach Anderson wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't going to make the pain go away. Jake told no one about the meeting. He left his house quietly, making sure his mother didn't hear him. The streets of Silverbrook were eerily quiet that evening, the usual calm of the small town now filled with an unsettling tension. Jake walked with his hands shoved into his pockets, his head down, his heart pounding with every step. Coach Anderson had asked to meet him at an old park on the edge of town. It was a place where few people went, especially at night, which made it the perfect spot for a secret meeting. As Jake approached the park, he could see Anderson's car already parked near the edge of the lot. The sight of it sent a chill through him, and for a moment he thought about turning back. But he kept walking. When Jake arrived, Coach Anderson was already waiting for him, standing by the swings with his hands in his pockets. The usual confident expression that Jake had seen so many times before was gone, replaced with something darker, something desperate. Anderson greeted him with a strained smile, trying to act casual, but there was an edge in his voice that made Jake feel uneasy. Anderson started talking quickly, his words spilling out in a rush. He tried to explain himself, saying that everything had been a misunderstanding, that Jake had taken things the wrong way, that the texts, the meetings, they had all been innocent. But his tone was frantic, almost pleading. Jake listened in silence, feeling his stomach turn. He knew none of this was true, and hearing Coach Anderson try to spin the story only made the weight of what had happened feel even heavier. The conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. Jake, tired of the lies and the manipulation, finally spoke up. He told Anderson that he knew what he had done, that there was no more pretending, no more covering things up. He was done with the games. Anderson's face twisted into something Jake had never seen before, a mix of anger, frustration, and fear. The calm, collected coach was gone, replaced by a man who had lost control. Anderson's voice grew louder, more aggressive. He started blaming Jake for everything, accusing him of ruining his life, of blowing things out of proportion. He said that if Jake had just kept quiet, none of this would have happened. The words stung, and for a moment Jake felt a surge of guilt, even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. But that feeling quickly turned to anger. Jake turned to leave, but Anderson grabbed his arm, his grip tight and unrelenting. Panic set in. Jake tried to pull away, but Anderson wouldn't let go. The coach's calm facade had completely shattered, and in that moment it was clear that things were far worse than Jake had imagined. The air between them felt thick with danger, and Jake's heart raced as he realized he wasn't safe. What happened next would change everything. In the heat of the moment, as Jake tried to free himself, Anderson pushed him hard, sending him stumbling backward. Jake's foot caught on the edge of a raised root, and he fell, hitting the ground hard. He lay there for a moment, dazed and in pain, as Anderson stood over him, his face twisted in rage. It was as if the coach had lost all sense of reason, consumed by fear and desperation. The next few moments were a blur. Anderson, in a fit of panic, lashed out, his hands shaking as he grabbed Jake by the collar, shouting incoherently about how Jake had ruined everything. There was no reasoning with him now. Jake fought to break free, but Anderson's grip was strong, fueled by a mix of anger and fear that had reached its boiling point. In the struggle, something terrible happened. Anderson shoved Jake again, harder this time, and Jake's head struck the edge of a metal bench that had been sitting nearby. The sickening sound of the impact echoed through the empty park, and everything went silent. Jake lay still, unconscious, blood pooling beneath his head. For a moment Anderson stood frozen, staring down at Jake's lifeless body. The reality of what had just happened slowly sank in. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He hadn't meant to hurt Jake, at least. That's what he told himself. But now it was too late. The boy who had once looked up to him, who had trusted him, was lying on the ground, and there was no way to undo what had been done. Panic set in as Anderson realized the gravity of the situation. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He couldn't call the police. How would he explain this? How could he convince anyone that this had been an accident, that he hadn't meant to kill Jake? He was sure no one would believe him. Desperation took over, and Anderson made a decision that would seal his fate. He fled the scene, leaving Jake behind. He got into his car and drove away, his mind racing with fear and confusion. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't escape the truth. Jake was dead, and there was no way to hide it. The town of Silverbrook was about to be rocked by a tragedy it had never seen coming. Back at home, Laura Matthews waited for Jake to return, growing more worried with each passing hour. When he didn't come home that night, she knew something was wrong. She called his phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. Fear gripped her as she realized that her worst nightmare might be coming true. The next morning, Jake's body was found by a jogger who had been passing through the park. The sight was enough to send shockwaves through the community. The police were called immediately, and within hours, the investigation had begun. Detective Lisa Harper, a seasoned investigator with the Silverbrook Police Department, was put in charge of the case. She quickly realized that this was no ordinary accident. As the investigation unfolded, the truth about Jake's relationship with Coach Anderson came to light. The messages, the secret meetings, the rumors, it all pointed to something much darker than anyone had imagined. The evidence began to pile up, and it became clear that this was not just a tragic accident. It was a crime. Detective Harper wasted no time in tracking down Coach Anderson. By the time they found him, he had gone into hiding, consumed by guilt and fear. When confronted with the evidence, Anderson broke down, confessing to everything. He told the detectives about the confrontation in the park, about how things had spiraled out of control, and how he had panicked in the heat of the moment. But no matter how many times he said it was an accident, the fact remained that Jake was dead, and Anderson was responsible. The town of Silverbrook was left reeling from the tragedy. What had started as a relationship built on trust and mentorship had ended in murder, leaving a community shattered and a family destroyed. The once respected coach was now the center of a criminal investigation, and the town that had once trusted him would never be the same. The discovery of Jake Matthews' body in the park sent shockwaves through the entire town of Silverbrook. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone knew that something terrible had happened. The quiet town, once a place where people felt safe, was now consumed by fear and grief. For Laura Matthews, it was a mother's worst nightmare. The moment she heard the news, her world collapsed, The image of her son lying lifeless in a park, the victim of a crime that should never have happened, would haunt her forever. Detective Lisa Harper took charge of the investigation. With years of experience under her belt, she had seen many tragedies unfold, but this case felt different. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Jake's death wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a deliberate act of violence, and Detective Harper knew that unraveling the truth would require more than just gathering evidence. It would require piecing together the lives of the people involved, understanding the secrets they had hidden, and bringing justice to a grieving family. The first step was the autopsy report, which confirmed that Jake had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The impact had been severe, leaving no doubt that the fatal injury had been caused by the fall during his struggle with Coach Anderson. But there was more. The bruises on Jake's arms told a story of a physical altercation, evidence that Jake had tried to defend himself during the confrontation. This was no accident. Jake had been pushed, and it had cost him his life. With this information in hand, Detective Harper began piecing together the timeline of events leading up to Jake's death. The investigation quickly led to Coach Mark Anderson. The text messages between him and Jake were incriminating, revealing a pattern of manipulation and control that had started long before that fateful night. The messages showed how Anderson had crossed boundaries, how he had blurred the line between mentor and predator, and how he had used his position of authority to exploit Jake's trust. But it wasn't just the texts. Witnesses from the school came forward, students who had seen Anderson's odd behavior, his fixation on Jake, and the secretive nature of their relationship. Some had seen them together in places they shouldn't have been, at times when no one else was around. The once respected coach, who had been a pillar of the community, was now the prime suspect in a murder investigation. As the evidence mounted, Detective Harper knew they had enough to bring Anderson in for questioning. The town was holding its breath, waiting for answers, but there was still one major hurdle: finding Coach Anderson. After the murder, Anderson had fled, leaving behind his house, his car, and his life in Silverbrook. He had gone into hiding, aware that the noose was tightening around him. The police launched a manhunt, scouring nearby towns, checking his known contacts, and watching for any sign of him. It took days, but eventually they found him. He had been staying in a motel just outside the town, trying to disappear, but the guilt had been too much to bear. When the police arrived, Anderson was sitting alone, staring at the television, a broken man. He didn't resist when they took him into custody. There was no fight left in him. His life, once filled with promise, had crumbled, and now he faced the consequences of his actions. At the police station, the interrogation began. Detective Harper sat across from Anderson, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the turmoil that must have been raging inside him. Anderson, visibly shaken, avoided eye contact at first. He seemed lost, his hands trembling as he tried to steady his voice. But Harper was patient. She knew that the truth had to come out, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. As the questioning continued, Anderson's facade slowly broke down. He tried to explain himself, stumbling over his words, claiming that everything had been a misunderstanding, that Jake had overreacted. He painted himself as a mentor who had cared too much, who had gotten too close to his students. But Harper wasn't convinced. The evidence was clear, and no amount of deflection could change the fact that Jake was dead. After hours of questioning, the truth finally came out. Anderson admitted to meeting Jake that night in the park. He said that he hadn't meant for things to go that far, that he had just wanted to talk to Jake, to clear the air. But when Jake tried to leave, things spiraled out of control. Anderson described the struggle, the moment when he had pushed Jake, and the sickening sound of Jake's head hitting the bench. It was clear that Anderson had panicked, realizing too late the gravity of what had happened. The confession, though full of excuses, was enough to confirm what Detective Harper had suspected all along. This was no accident. Anderson's actions had been reckless, driven by fear, desperation, and his inability to control a situation that had already gone too far. And now there was no escaping the consequences. With Anderson's confession in hand, the police officially charged him with manslaughter. The news spread quickly through Silverbrook, and the town was left grappling with the reality of what had happened. Coach Anderson, the man who had once been admired by so many, was now facing a prison sentence for the murder of one of his own students. The community, already shaken by the scandal, was left reeling, unsure of how to process the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. Jake's family, heartbroken and grieving, struggled to come to terms with the loss of their son. Laura Matthews, who had trusted Coach Anderson to guide Jake, now had to live with the knowledge that he had been the one to take her son away. The pain was unimaginable, and no amount of justice could bring Jake back. But the arrest of Coach Anderson brought some sense of closure, knowing that the man responsible for her son's death would face the consequences of his actions. The trial that followed was swift. Anderson's confession, coupled with the overwhelming evidence against him, left little room for doubt. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict guilty. Anderson was sentenced to prison, and the town of Silverbrook was left to pick up the pieces. The aftermath of the trial was difficult for everyone. The students at the high school, many of whom had once looked up to Coach Anderson, were left confused and angry. They had been taught to trust their teachers and coaches, to believe in the people who were supposed to guide them. Now, that trust had been shattered, and the school would never be the same. For Jake's friends, the loss was personal. They had known him as a quiet, hard-working kid, someone who just wanted to play basketball and get through high school. They struggled to make sense of why this had happened, why someone they trusted had been taken from them so violently. The halls of the school, once filled with laughter and the sound of bouncing basketballs, were now quiet, weighed down by grief. For Laura Matthews, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a long, painful journey. The loss of her son had left a void that could never be filled. She had to find a way to move forward, to keep living even when her world had been torn apart. The people of Silverbrook rallied around her, offering support and comfort, but no one could truly understand the depth of her pain. As the town tried to move on, the memory of Jake's death lingered like a dark cloud over Silverbrook. What had once been a tight-knit community had been shaken to its core, and the scars left by the tragedy would take years to heal. The basketball court, once a place of hope and ambition, now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. In the end, the story of Coach Anderson and Jake Matthews was a cautionary tale about trust, boundaries, and the devastating consequences of crossing them. It was a reminder that even the most respected figures can hide dark secrets, and that the people we trust the most can sometimes cause the greatest harm. The trial was over, but for the people of Silverbrook, the shock of what had happened lingered. Coach Mark Anderson, once a pillar of the community, was now behind bars, serving a lengthy prison sentence for the manslaughter of Jake Matthews. The case had been a tragic reminder that even in a quiet, close-knit town, terrible things could happen. Life in Silverbrook would never be the same. The days following the trial were marked by a deep sense of loss. The once lively high school halls felt quiet and somber. Students who had admired Coach Anderson struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the person now convicted of such a serious crime. The basketball court, where so many young athletes had once trained under his guidance, now felt like a place of grief, not joy. Jake's friends, who had shared his dreams and his love for basketball, found it difficult to return to their normal routines. Every corner of the school seemed to remind them of him. The empty seat in class, the absence of his laugh, and the basketball games without his presence were constant, painful reminders of their loss. Some of them sought counseling, struggling to cope with the emotions stirred by Jake's death and the revelations of what he had gone through. Laura Matthews, Jake's mother, faced the hardest path of all. Losing her son had shattered her world. No trial or conviction could ease the pain of knowing that Jake would never walk through their front door again. The house, once filled with Jake's laughter and presence, now felt unbearably quiet. For Laura, each day was a struggle to put one foot in front of the other. Her grief was deep and overwhelming, but she knew she had to keep going, if not for herself, then for Jake's memory. Support poured in from the community. Neighbors, friends, and even people who had never met Jake before reached out to offer their condolences. Silverbrook's residents came together to help Laura, organizing memorial services, setting up a scholarship fund in Jake's name, and offering to support her in any way they could. But for Laura, the pain remained, and the loss felt like a wound that would never heal. In the months that followed, Silverbrook tried to find a way forward. The school implemented stricter policies regarding student-teacher relationships, hoping to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. There were meetings with parents, discussions with teachers, and workshops for students, all focused on rebuilding trust and ensuring safety. But the damage had been done, and for many it felt like something precious had been taken from the town. For Detective Lisa Harper, the case had been one of the most difficult of her career. She had seen many cases of wrongdoing, but this one was different. It wasn't just the crime that weighed on her, it was the trust that had been broken, the lives that had been shattered by someone who should have been a protector. She had done her job, brought the truth to light, and ensured that justice was served. But like everyone else, she knew that justice couldn't undo the harm that had been done. Coach Anderson's arrest and conviction had left a lasting impact on the community. While some were relieved that justice had been served, others still struggled to believe that a man they had respected could be capable of such betrayal. Anderson had been a part of their lives for years, and now, he was a reminder that even those who seem trustworthy can hide dark secrets. In prison, Anderson had time to reflect on what had happened. His once promising life had been reduced to a series of regrets and missed opportunities. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences of his actions had left him isolated and alone. His legacy, once built on the admiration of his players and the respect of the community, was now one of disgrace. There were no second chances, no going back to the life he had known before that night in the park. Anderson would spend the rest of his days behind bars, thinking about the choices that had led him to this point. Silverbrook, though scarred by the events, slowly began to heal. The community rallied around Jake's memory, determined to honor his life. A memorial was built at the high school in his name, a small but meaningful gesture to ensure that he would never be forgotten. His friends visited it often, leaving flowers, notes, and small tokens that reminded them of their time with Jake. For them, the pain of his loss would never fully fade, but they found comfort in remembering the good times they had shared. As time passed, the town gradually began to return to some sense of normalcy, but the memory of what had happened was always there, just beneath the surface. Silverbrook was no longer the same quiet, trusting place it had once been. People were more cautious, more protective of their children, and more aware of the dangers that could lurk even in the most unexpected places. In the end, the tragedy of Jake Matthews' death became a cautionary tale for the town. It was a reminder that trust must be earned, that boundaries should never be crossed, and that even in a small, tight-knit community, secrets can lead to devastating consequences. The story of Coach Anderson and Jake Matthews would be told for years to come, not just as a tale of a crime, but as a lesson in the importance of vigilance, integrity, and the value of human life. As Silverbrook continued to rebuild, the people of the town held on to the hope that, despite the darkness of the past, there was still a future worth striving for, a future where no one would have to suffer as Jake had, and where trust could once again be restored.